Good day, co-philosophers and environmental ethicists. Thought I'd catch up on some of my recent blog posts in a video. So I'm going to start with today at dawn, the post I put up this morning in the wee hours, and then we'll move backwards in the direction of Monday. Today's blog post is called Sustained. Today in environmental ethics, we ask if a sustainable civilization must at some point, possibly the point we passed the day before yesterday, figuratively speaking, must impose limits on its own growth, or whether it must acknowledge nature's ecological limits. But because whatever is sustainable is not necessarily good, we must also ask what in our present ways of living we ought to cease sustaining. I say, sustain life, diversity, biodiversity, renewability, survival, and ultimately the conditions of human flourishing. Stop sustaining consumption for its own sake, work for the sake of consumption, environmental degradation, and destruction for the sake of the work, consume cycle of so-called growth, which is more like a cycle on a treadmill. We were talking about Aristotle in CoPhi. He'd have something to say to us about real growth and flourishing, and how our infatuation with gross domestic product and the like underserves, really undercuts our greatest potential for what they called arete in Greece, excellence, virtue really in its deepest sense. He'd side, I'm pretty sure, with the Bhutanese and others who've proposed that we adopt better measures like gross national happiness. But he'd challenge us all to think more deeply than American pursuers of happiness typically do about what happiness is really all about. Eudaimonia, I love to say, does not mean that you work hard, consume excessively, and then you die. That doesn't sound like a good life. It means you only begin to live when you give up the false conceit that living successfully means getting and spending, depleting resources, accumulating consumer crap. So, success? What is that, Willie James? Well, he had an answer in a letter he wrote in, I think, 1906. The moral flabbiness, born of the exclusive worship of the bitch goddess success, that, with the squalid cash interpretation put on the word success, is our national disease. So he told time machine inventor H.G. Wells. Just wish he'd not confused things by calling pragmatism a quest for cash value. It's a metaphor. Metaphors can enlighten, but they can also mislead. The point is, successful living does not correlate with your bank balance or your contribution to Jeff Bezos's bottom line. Not if by success you mean something like flourishing and excellence and a good life. So to answer my first discussion prompt of the day, yes, I do think there are inherent limits to growth. Title of an important study that was released several decades ago that not enough people took seriously. Inherent limits to growth that should constrain cultural and personal behaviors that cannot be sustained indefinitely. As one of us pointed out in class the other day, many of us would need 3 or more Earths to sustain the consumptive lifestyles we've so casually fallen into, drifted into. But here's something positive the pandemic's brought about, if only temporarily. The personal practice of mine that, from an ecological standpoint, has most troubled me, these many years of my employment by the big school down the road, has been halted in its tracks since March. My daily fossil fuel burn, my commute down and back on I-24. It's over. Haven't been to school in weeks. When we go back to normal, I'm going to have to give serious consideration to becoming a bus commuter, even though it will lengthen the time of my commute considerably. And who really wants to go to Smyrna? Sorry, Smyrnans. Or else, we're going to have to revisit a move, which we seriously entertained and almost pulled off this past summer. But I'm still skeptical that either of those personal lifestyle changes, or any lifestyle changes, no matter how prevalent across our culture, will really address the great threats to sustainable civilization, the greatest threats. To do that, we've got to go after those with a vested interest in fossil fuels. We've got to keep their reserves in the ground. I'm skeptical in the sensible sort of way about all that, not the Pyrrhonic, self-devouring way. That's what we'll begin talking about today in CoPhi. Is it advisable, or even possible, to go through life without firm opinions? Is it a promising strategy for happiness, to free yourself from desires and not care how things turn out? No and no, my answers. We've got to desire a sustainable and gratefully inheritable home for ourselves and for our successors. We've got to care. Because as the Lorax told us, if someone like you doesn't care a whole heck of a lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. So that's this morning's Up at Dawn post. If you want to read it, J.P. Ossifer, JPO being my initials, Ossifer being my Twitter handle that was hung on me a long time ago by a coworker who thought it was funny that somebody named Oliver was also a philosopher. Phil Oliver, the philosopher. But yesterday, I posted a follow-up to a post last week, How the World Thinks, based on the book that we're reading by Julian Baggini, which is laying around here somewhere. And so yesterday I posted more How the World Thinks, more musings prompted by Baggini's book, his attempt to give us a survey of global philosophy and for once broaden our horizons here in the West from just the usual suspects, starting with Socrates, or maybe the pre-Socratics, and coming forward and never venturing off this continent, or this continent and the European continent, Western European. Doctrines are less important in Buddhism than they are in Western Christianity. This is a quote from Baggini. In part because it is believed that the purest knowledge of reality comes from direct experience. A belief about the relative unimportance of belief then makes belief less important. If, as so many students like to punctuate and safeguard even their safest assertions, if that makes sense, I don't think it makes much sense myself. To know that one does not know is best. That's Taoism. But it's also Socrates. These traditions, superficially so different, converge at the source. Sometimes. More frequently than we realize. This is why we need poetry, to give us some sense of what we cannot precisely capture in language. Another quote. Actually, I think poetry sometimes does that, sometimes evocatively and subtly, but other times it gives us precision in language that we otherwise cannot fully capture in feeling. It reverses the terms there. Consider, on September 1, 2020, yesterday when I posted this, W.H. Audin's poem entitled September 1, 1939. He wrote, "The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night." Toward the end of the poem, he says, "We must love one another or die." Got that from the Writer's Almanac. That's precision in language, aligning with an inchoate feeling of outrage and futility as street violence in places like Portland spirals beyond control and will undoubtedly remind people of things spiraling out of control in 1930s Germany. John Locke, mentioned him yesterday and his blank slate, vaunted champion of tolerance and individual liberty that he was, still said we should not tolerate atheists because they can't be trusted to keep promises. A prevalent myth that I'm still fighting. What would he think of the fastest growing belief about non-belief? You might just have to write a poem. The fastest growing belief is non-belief. It was a tweet from Steven Pinker that was retweeted and commented upon by Nigel Warburton, one of our authors. And it is indicative of the fact that more and more young free thinkers are increasingly comfortable enough with their free thought, which is a euphemism for either atheism, agnosticism, or humanism, or some other ism that is not quite aligned with the faith of their fathers and mothers. The point is, until people discovered that they were not alone in their unbelief, or their alternative belief, I would prefer to put it, they stayed in the closet of conformist faith, or at least the pretense of conformist faith. But once people discovered, they've told me this in my atheism and philosophy course, once they discovered that there was a vast and growing constituency of free thinkers out there on the internet, that emboldened them to come out of their closets. Well, here was Monday's post called Moving Forward, going back to what we were doing earlier in Robin Attfield's Environmental Ethics, a very short introduction. Today in Environmental Ethics, Monday, we wonder, or Robin Attfield and I do anyway, if people who say they don't care about the long-term future of humanity are declaring the shocking opinion that their death, their personal death, effectively obliterates the moral universe. And what's a moral universe? Best statement of it I know is William James's in The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life, in the passage at the end of part 2 that begins, "Were all other things, gods and men and starry heavens, blotted out from this universe, and were there left but one rock with 2 loving souls upon it, that rock would have as thoroughly moral a constitution as any possible world which the eternities and immensities could harbor." James also said our one really vital question is, what is life going to make of itself? What is this world going to be? Well, life goes on. As Samuel Scheffler's Thought Experiments in Death and the Afterlife, and in a Stone essay, which I've linked to if you read my text and want to read, they make clear. Scheffler's Thought Experiments in Death and the Afterlife and in a Stone essay make clear that life goes on, and don't make that the cliche that it might sound like. Consider a hypothetical scenario, he says. Suppose you knew that although you yourself would live a long life and die peacefully in your sleep, the earth and all its inhabitants would be destroyed 30 days after your death in a collision with a giant asteroid. And I think there's one coming, right? I hope it's not too giant. How would this knowledge affect you? Well, it affects me with the realization of just how much I rely on the assumption of humanity's endurance and advance for my own sense of meaning and purpose. So long as we're here and they're here after I'm gone, the moral universe subsists. I don't have to be here, neither do you. Good thing, because we won't be. But while we're here, what did Dr. Flicker say? You got to enjoy yourself, Alvy, while you're here. While we're here, let's appreciate the natural universe too. Margaret Wrinkle's latest column is another gem meditating on the wildlife just beyond her window and concluding how lucky I am to live in a home with windows. Against all odds, the encroachments of construction companies and lawn services and exterminators, these windows still open onto a world that stubbornly insists on remaining wild. I love the bluebirds, and I also love the fierce hawk who reminds me that the peace of the backyard is only a fiction. I love the lizard who looks so much like a snake, and I also love the snake who would eat her if he could. And my friend the mole, oh, how I love my old friend the mole. In these days that grow ever darker as fears gather and autumn comes, I remember again and again how much we all share with this soft, furry creature trundling through invisible tunnels, in the dark, hungry and blind, but working so hard to move forward all the same, moving forward. That was in Monday's New York Times. Margaret Wrinkle, the Nashville resident who writes that column. So consistently good. William Blake, she reminds us, was right about this. I think he was wrong about plenty else, but never mind. That's another story. He was right. Every living thing is holy. Holy doesn't have to mean supernatural, by the way. And while every living thing is still destined to live out its unique and personal existence in the blink of an eye, certainly cosmically speaking, a blink of an eye, we still have it in our power to refrain from acts that would end the marvelous parade of living beings whose extinction would be the annihilation of the moral universe. That includes us, but not only us. A related question: do those who have a harder time caring about their hypothetical great-grandchildren, etc., than children and grandchildren lack a moral imagination, or are they merely human, all too human? It's a Nietzschean phrase, if you're not familiar. In CoPhi on Monday, we turned from Plato to his disillusioned student Aristotle. Disillusioned, that is, with respect to Plato's invisible world of the forms and the transcendent forms, the ethereal ideas. I asked my usual question as we pondered Raphael's School of Athens: which side are you on? And I endorsed Aristotle's view that a virtuous character rests on solid habits. I brought Willie James into it again, too, with his enormous flywheel of society statement. He said, good habits constitute the enormous flywheel of society. They're what make it go. Make life livable. I've got a link to Maria Popova, who's also a fan of James and his ideas about habit, which ultimately trace to Aristotle. If you want to link to Maria's Brain Pickings site and read about James on habit, read that full quote about the flywheel. We noted Kurt Anderson's Fantasyland appreciation of Sir Francis Bacon's early insight about humans' tendency to embrace superstition. Notice only those instances of experience that seem to confirm it, while selectively ignoring other instances that do not. He didn't call that confirmation bias, but that's just what it is, and we're all prone to it. In Bugini's How the World Thinks, we intended to go with him, I think we did talk about this, to the Indian Philosophy Conference, where, quote, no questions were taken, in sharp contrast to what typically goes on at American academic philosophical conferences. I've been to more of those than I care to remember. And that seems very strange to us, to those of us who've attended many of those functions. Is it an error or just an alternative approach, the Indian approach that takes no questions? Both East and West are smitten with the metaphor of seeing, but mustn't we also analyze, cogitate, interrogate, and converse about our different perspectives, our different visions, in order to figure things out? One thing I do find appealing, but finally not defensible in the Indian approach to pedagogy: students are always supposed to defer to their teachers, even when they're wrong. I wonder what that's like. The Japanese philosopher Nishida Kitaro said, it is the artist, not the scholar, who arrives at the true nature of reality. But he was a scholar, so what did he know? My view is that Western philosophy is right to distance itself from the idea of philosopher as sage or guru, but a little more artistry in our discourse and our publications would be welcome. And I guess that's enough for now. So see you guys in class.